some hope in the war-ravaged Middle East. It looks like, at long last, there is going to be a ceasefire in Gaza, a hostage release, a release of prisoners held in Israel. This is very good news, particularly for the long-suffering people in Gaza who apparently have suffered 45,000 or more deaths, an untold amount of injuries, disease, hunger.
I think both of us are relieved that there's a ceasefire deal. The suffering and death in Gaza has been horrific. There's a lot of other stuff going on too. Biden's farewell address, the Trump appointee confirmation hearings. But let's start with our headline. Let's continue with this story. What's your take on this, Dad? I know Trump has taken credit for it. The Biden-Harris administration has taken credit for it. What's your full take on this possible ceasefire in Gaza?
I don't really care who takes credit for it at this point. What I really care is that the deal is finalized and does lead to some kind of rapprochement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Remember, it's not a permanent ceasefire. It's not a release of all of the hostages at this point, and it doesn't really resolve the bigger issues in the Middle East. Who's going to govern Gaza? Are we going to ever have a two-state solution? Is Donald Trump going to pretty much cave in to Netanyahu? And there are even those in the cabinet, by the way, who are even more extreme than Netanyahu. There are a couple of ministers who oppose this deal, who think it's a capitulation to Hamas and the Palestinians. And these folks, even to the right, amazingly, of Netanyahu, hard to believe, want to continue the war. They want to totally wipe out and destroy Hamas, which, of course, is never going to happen. You can't solve these problems by military means. You know, I'm fond of quoting one of my favorite presidents, a Republican, Dwight Eisenhower, who said, you know, some 70 years ago, nothing gets solved in the Middle East until you solve the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, and there is no military solution. So I am glad that it looks like there is going to be a cessation of this horrific carnage in Gaza, at least for a time. But all of the big issues between the Israelis and the Palestinians are yet to be resolved. And all of this is going to fall into the lap of the new president, Donald Trump. Now, what I also understand is that the terms of this deal are exactly, or maybe not exactly, but pretty much the same as what President Biden set forth last May. You know, there has been this incredibly long delay in working out a deal. The framework had been long ago established. Why the delay? Obviously, Netanyahu is under a lot of pressure from those on his right who are important to his ruling party. And Netanyahu himself wanted to postpone the deal until he could inflict more damage on Hamas, take out some of its leaders, weaken its infrastructure, weaken its hold on Gaza. And then finally, I think another reason for the delay, I can't prove this. As you know, I'm very careful in saying what I think I know and what is opinion and speculation. You recall, many, many months ago, long before Biden dropped out, what did I say was the most important thing that could help Biden get reelected?
A ceasefire in Gaza.
Remember, let's not forget, Netanyahu is Donald Trump's man in Israel. He has always had the support and the promotion of Donald Trump and the American right. No way Netanyahu was going to give something to Biden that would help Biden or any Democrat get reelected and defeat Donald Trump. On the other hand, I've got to give Trump some credit. You know, his special envoy to the Middle East participated in the final stages of getting this ceasefire agreement across the finish line. You know, it shows when it's in the interests of both parties, we can have some kind of bipartisan cooperation. That's really the only way you're going to get anything done that's really in the interest broadly of the American people and the people of the world, as opposed to being in the partisan interests of one side or another. I'm not optimistic about it, but maybe there's the tiniest glimmer of hope that the bipartisanship on working out this deal could extend into the administration of Donald Trump. But there is still so much to be worked out in the Middle East. And sad to say, I don't believe either Netanyahu or Donald Trump is open to really the only long-term solution to the conflict here. It's not military, it's political and diplomatic, and that is the two-state solution. Netanyahu, quite the opposite, seems intent on annexing the West Bank as part of Israel and promoting more and more settlements, and likely would get the agreement of Donald Trump in doing that. I'm not certain of that, but that does appear to be likely, and that is going to, continue to prolong the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis that has been going on for such a long time with such tragic results on both sides.
You said it all, Dad. I got nothing to add.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the confirmation. It's moving at warp speed. Now, one of the most interesting confirmation hearings is Scott Bessent, who is being appointed to what critical position?
Treasury Secretary.
Yes. And you pointed out to me that he has a rather strange background for a Trump appointee, right?
So I went digging on this guy, Scott Bessent, a little bit because there was a clip of him and Bernie Sanders asking him if he would raise the federal minimum wage. This guy, Scott Bessent, said no. And this is a guy that, is plenty qualified. Actually, we were discussing he's the first openly gay Republican cabinet member ever, which is cool. Breaking glass ceilings is cool.
He's one of the lesser controversial
picks. But I just
he's actually leaving out his views in terms of his background. He's certainly qualified, having participated in our economic system at a very high level.
Yeah, but I was sort of curious when I saw this exchange between him and Bernie Sanders when he said he wouldn't be open to raising the federal minimum wage. I just looked him up. I thought, this guy, how much is this guy worth? Who is this guy? He's worth at least $500 million, if not a billionaire. He, interestingly enough, used to be a partner at the George Soros Fund, which I found sort of odd too. So three things I found interesting is one, Trump and his allies are always willing to make Soros the boogeyman, but if one of his money guys wants to go on their team, they'll take him with open arms. I thought that was interesting too.
Are you suggesting some hypocrisy here?
I'm suggesting some hypocrisy.
Heavens, who would imagine?
We've talked a lot about, the oligarchy and the ultra rich taking over. I think this is just another example of it. This billionaire sitting before us telling us that he won't raise the minimum wage from
$7.25. It hasn't changed in 16 years. Republicans are screaming about this inflation, and yet their minimum wage is 16 years old and doesn't take into account any of the inflation that has incurred at any point.
And I also found it interesting because we talk a lot about how Trump actually isn't a populist. And
I had a whole lecture on that.
Right. And I think this guy sort of personifies that exact rhetoric that we put out a lot. Billionaire, won't raise the minimum wage, is going to be in charge of our treasury. You also found some stuff about him wanting to...
Look, they won't raise the minimum wage. That's about $15,000, $16,000 a year. Nobody can live on that. Yet here's a billionaire saying, it's really a state and local matter. I can deflect it. It's the federal minimum wage. It sets a standard for the states, and it is unlivable. What he does want to do is big tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy. When you cut corporate tax cuts, obviously you're helping America's wealthy corporate interests. When you cut the personal income tax because of the way it's structured, most of the gains, not all of them, but this is well established, goes to the top 1% and the top 5%. So let's make the rich richer and keep the working class bitingly poor. This is not populism.
No.
This is the exact opposite of populism. The thrust of populism, as our lecture pointed out, was to challenge the very rich in the interests of ordinary farmers and workers. What this administration represents is just the opposite, which brings us to another important point. We had Joe Biden's farewell address.
Yes, and in his farewell address, addressed this and said and warned about the ultra-rich and warned about the oligarchy taking control of our government.
Right, the technical industrial complex. You know, Dwight Eisenhower in 1961 warned about the grip of the military industrial complex on our society. It's gone way beyond that. We still have the military industrial complex, but we also have much broader oligarchical control over our lives, our government, our economy, and our society. And the other thing that they're going to balloon the deficit, just extending the Trump tax cuts, according to independent analysts, is going to balloon the deficit, the debt rather, by $4 trillion, not billion, $4 trillion over the next 10 years. And of course, the Republicans are screaming about, you know, the Biden deficits and how he's added to the national debt and how they're going to cut it. And they're claiming, of course, that this is going to be offset by spending cuts, right? Mm-hmm. They have this group, the DOGE, the DOGE group, headed by a couple of billionaires. Right.
More billionaires.
Right, not ordinary folk. Well, this was tried before under Ronald Reagan, where he said, I'm going to have this commission that's going to cut waste and inefficiency and offset my big tax cuts. And just like this commission, it was headed by one of the richest persons of that time, Peter Grace, the head of W.R. Grace, the big shipping conglomerate. And did it work?
No.
It was a crashing failure, because the truth is there are 4 big spending elements to the federal budget. Do you know what they are?
Military.
They're not going to cut the military. They want to increase spending on the military.
Social
Security and Medicare, Medicaid. Servicing on the debt. None of those are cuttable. During the Reagan administration, none of that happened because members of the House and the Senate were not willing to kill Santa Claus in their states and their districts. And by the way, the medical programs and Social Security, they're largely check-writing operations. There's very little administrative cost. The only way you could save a lot of money is actually to cut into the programs themselves.
So anybody comes to you telling you that Trump is for the working class, just clip this and send it to them, right?
Yeah.